To the old lady who still thinks this ranch belongs to her. My son slurred into his whiskey glass, while the entire dining room went silent around him. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended me either. The only sound was the soft clink of silverware against china, and the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the dining room George and I had built together 43 years ago. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap and stared at the birthday candles flickering in front of me. 86 years old. I had imagined this dinner differently. I had spent the entire afternoon arranging fresh flowers from the garden in crystal vases George bought me during our trip to Santa Fe back in 1989. I had worn the navy blue sweater Claire gave me last Christmas and even curled my silver hair the way George used to like. The smell of roasted chicken and buttered rolls still lingered in the air, warm and familiar, but suddenly the room felt cold enough to freeze over. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the careless arrogance of a man who had already decided the ending of someone else's story. His cheeks were flushed red from bourbon. Vanessa sat beside him with one manicured hand wrapped around her wineglass, staring down at the table like she was embarrassed, though not embarrassed enough to stop him. My granddaughter Claire looked pale across the table. Her fork rested untouched beside her plate. "Dad?" she whispered softly, but Daniel only laughed again. "Come on," he said loudly. "We're all thinking it. Dad's been gone 3 years, and Mom still acts like she owns every inch of this place." I looked toward the windows behind him where the dark Texas fields stretched endlessly under the night sky. George loved those fields. Every fence post, every horse stable, every acre of dry grass had passed through his hands at some point. I could still picture him standing outside at sunrise in his denim jacket with coffee steaming in his hand. Daniel kept talking, his voice growing rougher with every sip. "You know what Dad used to say? He said this ranch was supposed to stay in the family. But nobody can move forward while she keeps holding on to the past." The past. That was an interesting word coming from a man who hadn't repaired a single fence on this property in 20 years. I noticed Claire watching me carefully, waiting for tears maybe, or anger, or some kind of collapse. But grief teaches you strange things as you age. One of them is how to sit quietly while your heart breaks in public. I reached for my water glass slowly, careful not to let my hands shake. "Dinner's getting cold," I said softly. That seemed to irritate Daniel more than if I had yelled at him. He let out a bitter laugh and pushed his chair back hard enough to scrape the hardwood floor. Vanessa finally touched his arm gently. "Daniel," she murmured, but her voice carried no urgency, no real concern, just performance. I suddenly understood something sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights. This dinner had never really been about my birthday. It was about pressure, about humiliation, about making me feel old enough, weak enough, and unwanted enough to finally let go of the ranch. And that was the moment I decided to open George's old safe for the first time since the day we buried him. I waited until everyone had gone upstairs before I walked into George's old office at the back of the house. The hallway lights were dim, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and the ranch felt painfully quiet after the forced laughter from dinner. Even after 3 years, I still expected to hear George's boots somewhere in the distance or the low hum of his voice drifting from the television in the den. Grief does not disappear with time. It simply learns how to sit quietly beside you. I pushed open the office door slowly. The familiar scent of leather, cedarwood, and old paper wrapped around me immediately. George had spent countless evenings in this room balancing ranch accounts, reading cattle reports, or listening to baseball games on the little radio beside his desk. Nothing had changed much since the funeral. His reading glasses still rested on top of a yellow legal pad. A faded University of Texas coffee mug sat near the lamp exactly where he had left it. I had dusted the room every Sunday morning, but otherwise I could never bring myself to move anything. The old safe stood behind a framed landscape painting near the bookshelf. George installed it almost 20 years ago after a tornado damaged part of the barn and scattered important paperwork halfway across the property. I remember teasing him at the time, asking what secrets a rancher in his 70s could possibly need to lock away. He had smiled at me and said, "Just promises I might need to protect someday." Back then, I thought he was talking about money. Now I was not so sure. My hands trembled slightly as I moved the painting aside. I had not touched the safe since the morning after his funeral when Mr. Whitmore handed me the combination written carefully on a folded piece of paper. I stared at the metal dial for a long moment before turning it slowly. The soft clicking echoed through the office. 32. 11. 48. The lock released with a heavy metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Inside were neatly stacked folders, old property deeds, insurance documents, and several sealed envelopes with George's handwriting across the front. I swallowed hard at the sight of it. George always had strong handwriting. Steady, confident. The kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who knew exactly where he stood in life. I sat down in his old desk chair and carefully opened the top envelope. For Evelyn, it read on the front. Just seeing my name written by his hand again made my chest ache. Inside was a short letter dated 8 months before his death. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But lately I have seen things in Daniel that remind me too much of my own father after the oil crash back in 1974. Pride mixed with desperation can turn good men into careless ones. If there ever comes a day when someone pressures you about this ranch, promise me you will not make decisions out of guilt or loneliness. You built this life with me. Never let anyone make you feel like a guest in your own home. I lowered the letter slowly and stared out the office window into the darkness beyond the pasture fence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried into the night. Suddenly Daniel's words at dinner sounded different in my memory. Less emotional, more calculated. I looked back inside the safe and noticed another folder tucked beneath the property deeds. On the tab, in George's handwriting, were 6 words that made my stomach tighten instantly. Do not show Daniel this yet. I stared at the folder for several seconds before finally pulling it from the safe. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Outside the office windows, the wind moved softly through the oak trees lining the driveway, and somewhere near the horse barn, an old metal chain tapped rhythmically against a fence post. Ranches have their own language at night. George used to say you could tell whether a place was at peace just by listening after midnight. Tonight the ranch sounded restless. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were copies of financial statements, handwritten notes, and several printed emails clipped neatly together. The first thing that caught my eye was Daniel's name beside a bank logo I recognized from Dallas. Past due notices, loan extensions, missed payments. I frowned and adjusted my glasses. The numbers looked unreal at first glance. George had highlighted certain lines in yellow marker. Credit card debt, business losses, refinancing requests. One document mentioned a failed investment in commercial property outside Austin. Another referenced gambling activity at a casino in Oklahoma. I leaned back slowly in George's chair, feeling a cold heaviness settle into my chest. Daniel had always loved expensive things. Even as a teenager, he chased appearances harder than substance. But George used to balance him out. My husband believed in hard work, in cash payments, in never owing another man more than you could repay with dignity. Debt changes people, he often said, especially men who are trying to outrun shame. I picked up another paper. This one was newer. Only 5 months old. It was a printed email exchange between Vanessa and a luxury real estate agent in Fort Worth. My stomach tightened as I read the words. The property is emotionally tied to my mother-in-law, but my husband should inherit full control soon. We are exploring discrete sale options after transition. Transition. Such a polished word for pushing an old woman out of her home. I pressed my fingertips against my temple and closed my eyes briefly. Suddenly, small moments from the past year rearranged themselves inside my memory like puzzle pieces finally locking together. Vanessa insisting I should stop managing the ranch accounts because it was too stressful at my age. Daniel offering to take over tax paperwork even though George always handled it with me personally. The sudden conversations about retirement communities with beautiful walking paths and medical support nearby. Even the birthday dinner tonight had not been spontaneous cruelty. It had been pressure, coordinated pressure. I opened the final envelope inside the folder. This one contained a short handwritten note from George dated just 3 weeks before his death. Evelyn, if Daniel ever begins speaking about the ranch as though you are standing in the way of his future, then you must understand something difficult. He is not thinking like a son anymore. He is thinking like a desperate man. Protect yourself first. Do not confuse guilt with love. I read the sentence 3 times. Protect yourself first. George had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough to worry. Enough to prepare. A soft knock startled me from the doorway. I quickly closed the folder. Claire stood there barefoot in an oversized sweatshirt, her blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked exhausted. "Grandma," she said quietly, "I saw your office light on." I forced a small smile. Could not sleep. Claire stepped into the room slowly, glancing toward the open safe behind me. Her eyes lingered there for just a second too long. Then she looked back at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not pity. Guilt. "Grandma," she whispered carefully, "there is something about Dad and Vanessa that you really need to know." Claire stood near the doorway, twisting the sleeve of her sweatshirt around her fingers, the same nervous habit she had as a little girl whenever she was afraid to tell the truth about something. I closed the folder quietly and motioned for her to sit down. She lowered herself into the leather chair across from George's desk and glanced toward the hallway as if she was worried someone might overhear us. The ranch house had always made sound travel strangely at night. Even whispers seemed to float through the walls. "Dad has been talking about selling the property for months," she finally admitted softly. "Not just talking. Planning." I kept my expression calm even though my heartbeat had started to pound heavily against my ribs. "How long have you known?" I asked. Claire swallowed hard before answering. "Since spring, maybe earlier." Outside, the porch light flickered against the dark yard, casting pale shadows across the office walls. Claire looked exhausted in that light. Older somehow. Like carrying secrets had slowly worn her down. "At first I thought they were just stressed about money," she continued carefully. "Dad said the ranch taxes were getting too expensive and that you deserved an easier life somewhere smaller. Vanessa kept talking about luxury retirement communities in Arizona and how peaceful everything would be for you there." She paused and looked down at her hands. But then I started hearing conversations that did not sound like concern anymore. I remained silent. Silence has a way of making people continue talking. George taught me that years ago during cattle negotiations. Eventually, Claire reached into the pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hesitated above the screen before she turned it toward me. "I did not know whether I should show you this," she whispered. The screen displayed a family group message I had never known existed. My eyes moved slowly across the words. Vanessa had sent links to luxury condominiums in Dallas along with comments about renovation profits once the ranch sold. Daniel joked about finally unlocking the land money. One message from Vanessa made my stomach tighten painfully. "Once Evelyn is settled somewhere supervised, everything becomes easier." Supervised. As though I were no longer a person capable of making my own choices. Another message mentioned meeting with a realtor next month to discuss listing strategies before the market shifts. Claire quickly lowered the phone when she saw the look on my face. "Grandma, I am sorry," she said quietly. "I should have told you sooner." I looked toward George's old hat hanging beside the bookshelf. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice somewhere deep in my memory. Calm, steady, practical. When people get desperate, Evelyn, they stop seeing family. They start seeing assets. At the time, I thought he was talking about business partners. I never imagined he meant our own son. "Does your father know you showed me this?" I asked gently. Claire shook her head immediately. "No. And if Vanessa finds out, she will lose her mind." The sadness in her voice caught my attention. Not anger. Sadness. Claire still loved her father despite everything. That was the cruel part about family betrayal. Love rarely disappears at the same speed as trust. "Grandma," she said after a long silence, "Dad was not always like this." I closed my eyes briefly. Neither of us needed convincing about that. I still remembered the boy who used to follow George around the ranch carrying tools too heavy for his small hands. Daniel at 12 years old sleeping beside sick calves in the barn because he was afraid they would die alone overnight. Daniel standing proudly beside George during county fairs wearing polished boots and a crooked grin. Somewhere along the way, ambition had hardened into greed, and greed had turned into resentment. Claire leaned forward slightly. "There is one more thing," she whispered. "Last week I overheard Vanessa telling Dad that if you refused to leave willingly, they would have to force the situation another way." I did not sleep that night. After Claire went upstairs, I remained alone in George's office listening to the old wall clock tick past 2 in the morning. The ranch house settled around me with familiar creaks and soft groans as the temperature dropped outside. I wrapped George's cardigan tighter around my shoulders and stared at the messages Claire had shown me. Strange how a few sentences on a screen could suddenly change the shape of an entire family. By sunrise, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and dust warmed by early Texas heat. I moved through my usual routine slowly. Feed the dogs. Open the back curtains. Water the basil near the sink. For years I believed routines protected people from loneliness. Now I realized they mostly protected us from noticing how much had already changed. Around 8:30, Daniel finally came downstairs wearing yesterday's wrinkled dress shirt. His eyes looked tired and swollen from bourbon. He stopped when he saw me standing at the stove making eggs. For a brief second, guilt crossed his face. Real guilt. The kind that almost makes a person apologize before pride steps in and ruins it. "Morning, Mom," he muttered hoarsely. I nodded gently. "Coffee is fresh." He poured himself a cup and avoided looking directly at me. The silence between us felt heavy, but not unfamiliar. We had been speaking around uncomfortable truths for months now. Vanessa entered the kitchen a few minutes later, dressed perfectly, as always in cream slacks, and a fitted sweater despite barely sleeping herself. She kissed Daniel lightly on the cheek before offering me one of her polished smiles. "How are you feeling this morning, Evelyn?" she asked softly. "Not Mom. Never Mom. Always Evelyn. Like a client. Or a patient." "I am fine," I answered. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel before opening the refrigerator. "We were actually thinking maybe today would be a good time to discuss some long-term planning," she said carefully. There it was. Less than 12 hours after humiliating me publicly at my own birthday dinner. I kept stirring the eggs calmly. Planning for what? Daniel finally looked up then, rubbing one hand against his jaw. "Mom, you know this place is becoming harder to manage." His tone carried that artificial patience adult children sometimes use with elderly parents when they want to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. The property taxes alone are almost $20,000 a year now. The ranch needs repairs. The fencing near the south pasture is falling apart. I placed the spatula down carefully. "Your father and I handled those expenses for decades." Vanessa stepped in smoothly before Daniel could respond. "Of course you did. But things are different now. We just worry about your quality of life." Quality of life. Another polished phrase hiding something ugly underneath. Daniel leaned against the counter and sighed heavily. "Mom, nobody is trying to hurt you. We just think maybe it is time to simplify things." Simplify. Sell the ranch. Move me somewhere supervised. Unlock the land money. Their words from last night echoed quietly inside my mind while I watched them stand together in my kitchen pretending concern. Then Vanessa reached into her handbag and placed a glossy brochure on the counter beside me. Sunridge Senior Living Estates. Smiling gray-haired couples walked through manicured gardens beneath bright Arizona sunshine. "We toured this community last month," she said softly. "It is beautiful. Private cottages. Medical staff 24 hours a day. Activities. Transportation. Everything you could need. Last month. Before my birthday. Before tonight's argument. Before they ever discussed it with me. They had already been planning my future without my permission." I looked down at the brochure for several long seconds before lifting my eyes toward Daniel. "You toured retirement homes for me without asking?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa answered instead. "We were only trying to be proactive." I smiled then. Calmly. Politely. The exact kind of smile George used whenever a businessman thought he had the upper hand too early in a negotiation. "That is thoughtful," I said quietly. "In fact, I think it may finally be time for us to discuss the future of this ranch properly." The kitchen became very quiet after I said that. Vanessa stopped smoothing the edge of the brochure with her fingertips. Daniel stared at me with the wary expression of a man suddenly unsure whether the conversation was still under his control. Sunlight spilled through the windows above the sink, catching tiny dust particles drifting lazily through the air. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of horses moving near the east fence line. Normal ranch sounds. Familiar sounds. The kind that reminded me this place had survived droughts, storms, market crashes, and 3 generations of Carter stubbornness long before my son ever decided he deserved to own it. Vanessa recovered first. She smiled gently and folded her hands together on the counter. "That is all we are asking for, Evelyn. An honest discussion about what is best moving forward." Best for whom, I wondered. But I only nodded softly and turned off the stove. "I think your father would have wanted everyone fully informed before any decisions were made," I said calmly to Daniel. His jaw tightened slightly at the mention of George. Guilt again. Brief, but visible. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked cautiously. I reached for my coffee cup and took a slow sip before answering. It means your father prepared more carefully than either of you realized. Neither of them spoke immediately. I could almost feel the tension settling over the kitchen table like humidity before a thunderstorm. Vanessa finally tilted her head slightly. Prepared how? She asked. Such a careful question. Too careful. George used to say the most dangerous people rarely raise their voices. They simply gathered information quietly while pretending not to care about the answer. I walked toward the doorway, carrying my coffee with steady hands. I have an appointment in town this afternoon, I said. I may be home late. Daniel frowned. What kind of appointment? I paused long enough to let the silence work for me. Legal matters. That changed everything. Vanessa's expression froze for half a second before she quickly recovered her smile. Daniel straightened immediately. Mom, nobody is fighting with you here. I know that, I answered softly. But when people begin discussing retirement homes before asking whether I actually wish to leave my home, it seems wise to review paperwork carefully. Daniel let out a frustrated breath and rubbed both hands over his face. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. You always think we are against you. I looked at him quietly. Were you planning to tell me about the realtor before or after you listed the ranch? The color drained from Vanessa's face instantly. Daniel turned sharply toward her. What realtor? He demanded. Interesting. So he did not know everything after all. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since George died, I saw a genuine panic flicker behind her polished composure. Daniel, she said carefully, I was only researching possibilities. You told me we were waiting until Mom agreed first. Oh, there it was. Cracks. Small ones, but enough. I remained perfectly still beside the doorway while the two of them stared at each other across my kitchen. Manipulative people often believe they are smarter than everyone else. What they forget is that greed eventually makes even partners stop trusting one another. Vanessa quickly shifted her attention back toward me. Evelyn, I think there has been a misunderstanding. No, I said gently. I believe things are finally becoming very clear. Then I walked out of the kitchen before either of them could stop me. 20 minutes later, I was driving George's old Ford pickup down the 2-lane highway toward Fort Worth with the folder resting quietly beside me on the passenger seat. The leather steering wheel felt warm beneath my hands. George always kept the truck immaculate, right down to the polished dashboard and folded road maps tucked inside the glove compartment. As the ranch disappeared slowly in my rearview mirror, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer frightened. Sad, yes. Heartbroken, absolutely. But not frightened. Because somewhere between Daniel's cruel toast and the hidden documents inside George's safe, I had stopped feeling like an old woman waiting to lose her home, and started remembering exactly whose name was still on every acre of that land. Fort Worth looked washed in pale afternoon sunlight by the time I parked outside Whitmore and Associates. The law office sat inside an old red brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse square, the same building George used for ranch contracts and estate paperwork for almost 30 years. Walking through those familiar glass doors felt strangely comforting. Some places carry the weight of honesty inside them. Mr. Whitmore himself opened the office door when his receptionist announced my name. He had aged considerably since George's funeral. His once dark hair was now almost completely silver, and deep lines framed his tired eyes, but his handshake remained steady. Evelyn, he said softly, genuine warmth entering his voice. I wish this visit were under better circumstances. I nodded politely and followed him into his office. Heavy oak bookshelves lined the walls beside framed photographs of cattle auctions, legal conferences, and old Fort Worth street scenes. George always trusted men who kept books instead of trophies in their offices. I placed the folder carefully on Whitmore's desk. I opened the safe last night, I said quietly. His expression changed immediately. Not surprise. More like concern finally arriving after years of waiting outside the door. He removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair. Then I assume you found George's letters. And Daniel's debt. Whitmore exhaled heavily through his nose and folded his hands together. George discovered the financial problems about a year before he passed away. My chest tightened slightly, even though part of me had already guessed that answer. Why did he not tell me? Whitmore looked toward the window for a moment before speaking. Because he hoped Daniel would recover before things reached this point. Your husband loved your son very much, Evelyn. But he also understood that desperation changes people. The room grew quiet. Somewhere outside, A siren echoed faintly through downtown traffic before fading into the distance. Whitmore finally opened one of his desk drawers and removed a thick legal binder. George made several revisions to the estate during his final months, he explained carefully. Not because he wanted to punish Daniel. Because he wanted to protect you. He slid the binder across the desk toward me. My name appeared on the cover beside the words Carter Ranch Family Trust. The ranch cannot legally be sold while you are alive without your direct written authorization witnessed by independent counsel, Whitmore explained. And if evidence exists showing coercion, manipulation, or financial pressure against you, Daniel's inheritance rights can be suspended entirely. I stared at him in silence. Whitmore continued carefully. There is more. He opened the binder to a marked page. George appointed Claire as secondary trustee after your passing instead of Daniel. That surprised me enough to finally speak. Claire, Whitmore nodded slowly. Your husband trusted her judgment. He believed she cared about preserving the ranch itself rather than liquidating it. I thought about Claire sitting nervously in George's office the night before with guilt written all over her face. Poor child. She had been carrying this burden alone for months. Daniel does not know any of this. I asked quietly. No, Whitmore answered. George instructed me very clearly. These documents were only to be disclosed if anyone attempted to pressure you regarding the property. Pressure. Such a polite legal word for betrayal. I lowered my eyes to the binder resting in front of me. George had seen this coming long before I had. Not every detail perhaps, but enough to prepare safeguards. Enough to realize our son might eventually confuse inheritance with entitlement. Whitmore's voice softened slightly. Evelyn, I need to ask you something difficult. Has Daniel threatened you directly? I considered the question carefully. Threats do not always arrive screaming. Sometimes they come wrapped in concern and retirement brochures. Sometimes they sit across from you at your own birthday dinner raising a whiskey glass, while pretending humiliation is only a joke. Not directly, I answered at last. But I believe they intended to make staying here painful enough that I would eventually surrender. Whitmore nodded grimly, as though my answer confirmed fears he already carried. Then he reached for another folder beside his desk and slid it toward me slowly. In that case, he said quietly, there is one final document George instructed me to show you only if things became serious. The final document inside Whitmore's folder was only 3 pages long, but by the time I finished reading it, my hands had gone completely still. George had written it himself 6 weeks before his death and attached it formally to the trust as a conditional directive. The language was calm, practical, very George. If any beneficiary of the Carter Ranch Family Trust attempts to pressure, manipulate, intimidate, or isolate Evelyn Carter in pursuit of property control, that beneficiary's inheritance rights shall immediately transfer to the secondary trustee. Claire. George had protected me even after death. Not with anger. Not with revenge. With foresight. Whitmore gave me time to absorb everything before speaking again. Your husband worried most about one thing, he said quietly. That loneliness might eventually make you surrender out of exhaustion. I looked down at the papers resting on the desk. The frightening part was that George had been right. Before the birthday dinner, before Claire showed me those messages, I probably would have given in eventually. Not because they deserved the ranch. Because I was tired. Tired people often confuse peace with surrender. Whitmore slid a business card across the desk toward me. I would strongly advise documenting every conversation moving forward, especially if they begin escalating pressure after realizing you know more than they expected. Escalating pressure. I understood immediately what he meant. People become dangerous when they realize control is slipping away from them. Not violent dangerous necessarily, but emotionally reckless. Desperate people stop pretending. The drive back to the ranch felt different somehow. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden light across the Texas highway while old country music played softly through the truck speakers. George used to love driving at this hour. He claimed sunsets made even difficult truths easier to face. When I turned onto the gravel road leading home, I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked beside the barn. Another vehicle sat near the house. A white Mercedes I recognized immediately. Realtor. So Vanessa had not waited long after all. I parked slowly beside the porch and stepped out of the truck holding Whitmore's folder firmly against my side. Laughter drifted faintly from inside the house, though it stopped almost immediately when the front door opened and Daniel stepped outside. His expression shifted visibly when he noticed the folder in my hands. "Mom," he said quickly, walking toward me. "We were wondering where you went." I glanced past him toward the living room window where Vanessa stood beside a sharply dressed couple pretending not to stare outside at us. "Apparently not enough to postpone company," I answered calmly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "This is not what it looks like." "No," I asked gently. "Then why is there a realtor inside my house?" His jaw tightened. "Vanessa invited them for preliminary advice. That is all." Preliminary advice. Before even asking permission from the woman still legally owning every acre. Interesting. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, then wearing her polished smile again. "Evelyn," she called pleasantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove specialize in luxury ranch properties." They were simply offering insight into current market conditions. I looked directly at her for several seconds before answering. That must have been difficult for them considering this ranch is not for sale. The silence that followed felt immediate and heavy. The realtor couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel stepped closer toward me, lowering his voice. "Mom, please do not make this awkward." Awkward? Such a strange word for betrayal. I met my son's eyes carefully then. Really looked at him. Beneath the frustration and defensiveness, I saw something else now. Fear. Real fear. Because for the first time since George died, Daniel no longer looked like a man certain of victory. He looked like a man beginning to realize the game had changed without him noticing. I smiled softly and walked past him into the house, carrying George's folder beneath my arm. "Actually," I said calmly as everyone turned toward me in the living room, "I believe it is finally time we all discuss exactly what George wanted done with this ranch." I walked into the living room slowly and placed George's folder on the coffee table between the realtor couple and Vanessa. Nobody sat down. The air inside the room felt tight and heavy, like the moment before a summer storm finally breaks open across dry Texas land. Claire had appeared quietly near the staircase sometime while I was outside. Her eyes moved nervously between her father and me, but she said nothing. Daniel crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "Mom," he warned softly, "this does not need to become a scene." I looked at him carefully. "You already made it one at my birthday dinner." The realtor couple exchanged another uncomfortable glance. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat politely. "Perhaps this is not the best time for a business discussion." "Actually," I said calmly, opening the folder, "this conversation concerns business more than anyone here realized." Vanessa's smile had disappeared completely now. George used to say masks always slip eventually. You just have to stop interrupting people while they reveal themselves. I removed the trust documents slowly and handed the first pages directly to Daniel. His eyes moved across the legal language at first with irritation, then confusion, then something closer to panic. "What is this?" he asked sharply. "Your father's final estate revisions," I answered. "The ones he prepared after discovering your debts." The room went completely silent. Vanessa's face drained of color. Daniel looked up immediately. "You went through my financial records?" "No," I said quietly. "Your father did. Before he died." Daniel stared down at the papers again with trembling hands. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked softly. "Would you like me to explain the refinancing notices from Dallas? Or perhaps the gambling withdrawals from Oklahoma?" Claire closed her eyes briefly as though hearing those words aloud physically hurt her. Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "Evelyn, this is private family information." "Exactly," I replied. "Which makes it interesting that both of you were already inviting realtors onto my property without permission." Mr. Hargrove immediately straightened awkwardly. "Mrs. Carter, we were under the impression ownership discussions had already been settled." "No," I answered politely. "Ownership discussions were happening around me, not with me." Daniel suddenly slammed the papers down onto the table hard enough to rattle the glass coasters beneath them. "Dad had no right to do this," he snapped. There it was. Not grief. Not shame. Entitlement. I watched my son carefully then. Really watched him. The flushed anger in his face. The desperation behind his eyes. The exhaustion of a man who had built his entire future around money he no longer controlled. "Your father had every right," I said quietly. "He built this ranch beside me from nothing but drought land and cattle loans. He protected it the same way he protected this family for 40 years. Daniel laughed bitterly. "Protected? By cutting me out." I shook my head slowly. "No, Daniel. You cut yourself out the moment you started treating me like an obstacle instead of your mother." Vanessa stepped toward him quickly, touching his arm as though trying to steady the situation before it collapsed completely. But the damage was already done. I lifted the final document from the folder and handed it toward Claire. "George named you secondary trustee," I said softly. Claire looked stunned. "Grandma, I never wanted—" "I know," I interrupted gently. "That is exactly why he trusted you." Daniel stared at his daughter in disbelief before turning back toward me. "So that is it?" he asked coldly. "You are just giving everything away?" I looked around the room slowly. At the polished furniture George restored by hand. At the photographs lining the mantel. At the windows overlooking the fields glowing gold beneath the setting sun. This ranch had never really been about money. That was the tragedy of it. "No," I answered quietly. "I am protecting what your father and I built from people who forgot its value." Nobody spoke after that. Even Vanessa finally lowered her eyes. A few minutes later, the realtor couple quietly gathered their paperwork and left without another word. Daniel followed them outside eventually, shoulders tense and face hollow with anger he no longer knew where to place. Claire remained beside me in the silent living room while the sunset stretched long shadows across the hardwood floors. I stood near the window looking out toward the pasture fence where George used to watch the evening light settle over the land every night before dinner. Age had taken many things from me over the years. Friends, strength, certainty. But standing there inside the home we built together, I realized something important. They thought getting older meant becoming weaker. What it had actually done was teach me the difference between loneliness and surrender. And for the first time since George died, this ranch finally felt like home again.